Hi everyone. This talk is a quick intro to NLP. We'll get to that in a moment though. First, who am I? Hi, my name is Paris. You can find me on Twitter at ParisBA. I do all sorts of stuff. I do way too many things to list here, but I'm probably best known for helping run Tasmania's longest running game development company, Secret Lab. I also write a lot of books. This is one of the most recent, but I've written about 30 technical books, and more to come. So, what's NLP? This talk is about NLP. It's good to start with a quick, what actually is it? NLP stands for Natural Language Processing. You've probably heard of it. It does not stand for Neuro-Linguistic Programming. That's something else much creepier. This talk is going to cover natural language processing and what you can do with it, what the current situation is, and how you can use it using a quick code example. Hopefully it'll be useful to inspire you to learn a bit more about natural language processing so you can get started in the field yourself. We'll start with the obvious. What is it? Natural language processing is about linking natural human languages, written and spoken, to the meaning, syntactic, semantic, and/or contextual levels. These multiple intersecting levels are really key to natural language processing, NLP, as understanding one of them without the others is basically meaningless. Historically, the complexity of each had led to many approaches to use separate systems for some parts of it, or even all of them. An ideal solution is to understand all three together, as well as the ways they interact and compound to obfuscate meaning. So NLP is a combination of things at multiple levels. NLP has had lots of historical challenges over the years. Words change meaning, and it's really hard to figure out what they mean sometimes. Does anyone know what poggers means, for example? It's a brand new word to me. I learned it the other day. Slang, idioms, homonyms. Some words have 2 meanings, or 3 meanings, or 4 meanings. Proper nouns. Sometimes names don't actually look like words, but they're names nonetheless. And implied context. Sometimes words change meaning depending on what you see around them. The actual task of natural language processing is used interchangeably to either refer to systems that interpret or generate natural language, as well as some that combine the two, although these are often actually separate systems that are glued together. There's lots of useful tasks around interpretation, things like sentiment analysis, trend detection and prediction, spam filters, automatic summary and keyword extractors and stuff like that. Incredibly useful. This is actually pretty hard. These are all pretty solid, hard computer science problems. As an example, what does this sentence mean? I saw a man in the office with a camera. Well, there's a bunch of possible meanings to I saw a man in the office with a camera. It could mean there is a man in the office and I watched him with a camera. It could mean there is a man in the office and he has a camera. It could mean I'm in the office and I saw a man using my camera or a camera. It could mean I'm in the office and I see a man who has a camera. It could mean there is a man in the office and I saw him do something with a camera. This is another example. There's 2 fine words, but both of them have different meanings. It's fine, he said. This isn't my first fine. What does it mean? The first can indicate that the speaker is fine or okay with the situation, and the second word perhaps indicates that they're talking about a parking fine or something similar to that. These examples show that processing language is not a deterministic process. The same language does not have the same interpretations all the time. Something that one person might intuitively understand would not make sense in the same way to another person. Another thing NLP can do is generating words. This can be used for art, for games, for all sorts of things. It's increasingly popular, particularly in this world of modern transformers, which we'll talk about a little bit later. Sometimes these things are combined. Processing, interpretation, and generation make great chatbots, virtual assistants, translating between languages, autocomplete on your phone, things like that. So that's a quick overview of what NLP does and can do. Let's talk about how we got there. It's been a really long road getting to the current state of NLP. The state of the art of NLP is amazing right now, and it wasn't always the case. The road to modern NLP arguably started in the 50s with symbolic systems. The first few decades, starting in the 50s, were systems made of semantic rules, which had to be provided by humans and were limited in the very specific domain roles they could fulfill. For example, simple translations could be done between well-mapped languages, with simple sentences made up of simple words. But this is basically just mapping one thing to another thing. The first chatbots existed in this era, but they were obviously even more limited. Particularly famous chatbot is Weizenbaum's Eliza, which could do things like If you feel, say, I feel X, it would say, why do you feel X? Or is it important that you feel X? It would do this by assigning a value to each word that was said to it, based on whether it was a noun or verb or whatever part of speech it was, and give the highest weightings to words that describe feelings or actions. It would then use predefined rules to flip around the sentence. For some, this was enough to give it the impression that it was actually intelligent and people would empathize with it. But you could quickly see the pattern if you spoke to it for a while. This method only seemed to work really in psychotherapy, where the human provided the information and the topic they wished to talk about. More than a conversation, ELIZA actually facilitated a good self-interrogation with a guide. There were other symbolic approaches, but eventually we figured out that writing rules for everything manually was not a great idea and was not going to hold up to time, maintenance, or scrutiny. It still has its uses though. So, the next, more interesting to me, era of NLP, and particularly more interesting to modern programmers, is statistical models. This is where the current methods often came from. But when it started, they really didn't have the means to do this with really significant computational power. We couldn't model anything too complex, and it didn't seem like it was performing super well for things that weren't relatively straightforward mapping problems, like translation, as we mentioned before. Claude Shannon had already proposed in the 40s that you could model the English language statistically. His early approach used Markov chains to generate text based on the statistical likelihood of the next letter following the previous one. This naturally produced gibberish, as you can see here, as the context of our language is typically more complicated than pairwise letter combinations. But he wasn't too far off. After decades of growth in compute power, we kind of get to the modern era where neural networks come to the fore. And people recognize that there was huge potential in modeling neural networks on computers. Artificial neural networks resurfaced, and organizations like IBM led the charge to automatically translate text using them, and other things. Everyone was into this idea that models could learn from language. And even though technically it was just a really big, really fast, really complicated Markov chain with multiple layers, it could model more complex relationships because of that. And it produced a tiny bit of contextual memory if you gave it some. In 2001, Yoshua Bengio and his team proposed perhaps the first neural net language model using a feed-forward neural network. The feed-forward neural network describes an artificial neural network that does not use connections to form a cycle. In this type of network, the data actually moves only in one direction from the input nodes through hidden nodes and into the output. This feed-forward neural network has no cycles or loops and was quite different from the recurrent neural networks of the time. After this, NLP really started accelerating. So now we're in this modern smart era of NLP, the really smart era. This third wave of NLP is actually pretty similar to what Shannon was doing in the 40s. We want to learn from the records of language that exist, rather than have a human tell a computer what they know. So we're following Shannon's approach where we're saying computers look at all this human knowledge, go from there, rather than teaching it rules. It's kind of more like statistical NLP version 2.0, just with more processes. There are lots of papers in this new modern statistical NLP era. Distributed representation of words and their phrases and their compositionality is a particularly key one from 2013. The significant research in this is actually very recent. GRUs and LSTMs, gated recurrent units, and long short-term memory units in ML models allow models to only keep relevant information from which to make predictions rather than use everything, and were a key point in making NLP possible using modern machine learning. And transformers are ridiculously hot right now. Transformers are a type of neural network that can handle sequential data in a not necessarily sequential manner. They can be parallelized very easily, and transformers have largely usurped LSTMs as the de facto standard in really big NLP. There's lots more, but basically lots of hot methods. They appeared in this order, and the gist is that we basically slowly approached a better form of transfer learning. We're learning with memory, where we basically learn from the past in the model to further the results of the model later on. So the model would remember what it needed to remember or discard what it didn't need to remember, and it would get better because of it. There's lots of hot models. Here's some of them. You've probably heard of them. There's BERT, the bidirectional encoder representations from transformers. There's GPT, generative pre-trained transformers. Basically, there are transformers everywhere, and there's a new one every few weeks these days. They're super popular. Transformers are way too complicated to talk about in a 40-minute talk that actually makes any sense, particularly introductory talk like this one, but they are very cool. What we can look at though is something a lot simpler, and it's a great place to get started in NLP, and that is bags of words. This is one of my favourite terms in computer science. A bag of words is a way to represent text data for machine learning to work with. Bags of words help us do this. A bag of words is simple to understand and implement, and it's a really good way of extracting features from text in order to mould them using machine learning. Let's take a look at a really quick example of a bag of words. Bag of words is where you tokenize words for each observation or each thing you want to learn about and count the frequency of each token. To understand this, we'll unpack it a little bit. Here's some example sentences. It was the best of times. It was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom. It was the age of foolishness. If we treat each sentence as a separate document or item and make a list of all words from all 4 documents, excluding punctuation, we get something that looks like this. It, was, the, and so on. The next step is to create vectors. So vectors are just basically a multidimensional array in this context. Vectors convert text that can be used by the machine learning algorithm into numbers that we can learn on or perform mathematical calculations on in some way. In this case, if we take the first line, it was the best of times, and we check for the frequency of the words that are in all of those sentences, there are 10 unique words, we come up with this. Now this is not a count of each word, this is just a bit mask, so if there's a 1 there, it means that word is present. If there's a 0 there, it means that word is not present. So in the case of the line, it was the best of times, it is present, whereas age, worst, wisdom, and foolishness are not present. The rest of the lines will be resembling this. These are the vectors for each of those lines. Again, this is a bit mask. 1 means a word exists, 0 does not. And the words are mapped to positions in this vector. So 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 0, and so on. In this approach, each word or token is called a gram. Creating a vocabulary of 2-word pairs is called a bigram model. For example, the bigrams in the first document, it was the best of times are it was the best, best of times. It's a bigram because there's 2 of them and we've just asked for 2. And we could have a trigram if we look for 3 words next to each other and so on. We're going to now jump to a bit of an activity and show you how you can do some of this stuff yourself. We'll do this in Google Colab, which is Google's online learning, machine learning, Python experimentation platform, which is based on Jupyter Notebooks. I'll tweet out some links while the talk is happening so you can play with this yourself. So I'm just going to switch to a little demo here. So here we have a really simple NLTK example. NLTK is a natural language toolkit framework you can load into Python. It's really, really good. nltk.org. Highly recommend it. I'm going to show you how to use some of the easy features of this to do really useful NLP stuff without having to code much. So we're going to import NLTK and import a bunch of tools to tokenize words, to plot some stuff, and to download a couple of stop words, which I'll explain in a second. I've got some text here. This is some text from Pride and Prejudice. It's public domain, so it's okay to use. So I'm going to run that through the thing. You'll see up there that my machine learning is running on Google's cloud, so we're just connecting to an instance there. Once we've initialized an instance, this is some fancy high-end backend that Google provides us. We'll download the packages I've asked for, and then we'll tokenize that sentence of text. So you'll see here there are 10 sentences in that text. That's pretty good. So look at those sentences. It's split out the sentences and sentence segments. So he cried his wife impatiently is a sentence as far as this is concerned. It might not be a sentence as far as a human's concerned. Lots of talking about Mr. Bennett. Mr. Bennett does lots of things in Pride and Prejudice. Let's have a look at how many words are in there. There's 185 words. Okay, so we can have a look at those words. You can see them there. You'll see there's some punctuation mixed in there. Punctuation is not technically a word, but for this, it's a word. So that's probably less than ideal. When we want to analyze some text, we don't necessarily want to include punctuation because it doesn't necessarily add much meaning. So we'll just plot a little frequency distribution of that text to have a look at it. And you can see actually most of our words are punctuation. So that's problematic. We probably want to get rid of those. We'll just plot that just to verify. And you can see, yes, look at all those punctuation marks. Probably not helpful. So, now that we can see there's too much punctuation there, we'll get rid of it by removing the punctuation. Here we go. We have a whole bunch of words now with no punctuation. Let's see how many words are in there. Lots, as it turns out. Other, said, his, Netherfield, Bennett, heaps and heaps of words. But again, not all those words are going to be useful. So we'll just take a quick look at that. There's now 149 words. That's a lot less. That's probably much more reasonable. But still, many of those words are stop words or joining words or connecting words like are, of, it, is. Those words are not particularly useful to us if we're going to perform some sort of analysis on this text. So like, we don't want to keep is in there. We don't want to keep the in there. Who cares about those? We're going to load some stop words in. Stop words come out of NLTK and they allow us to say these words are connecting and have no meaning. We're going to ask for the English stop words, which are I, me, my, myself, and so on. And then we're going to clean up our word list by removing them. Now we've done that, you'll see our words are actually much more interesting. Want is more prevalent. Bennett is more prevalent. Truth is more prevalent. That's a lot more useful to actually perform some analysis of this particular text on. Let's look at chunking now. Chunking takes some parts of speech tags as input and provides chunks as output. We've got this sentence, these are the voyages of the Starship Enterprise, and we're going to tokenize it. When we print out the token, you'll see that it tells us what these parts of speech are, like DT is a determiner, VBP is a plural, a present tense verb, and so on and so on and so on. But if we wanted to extract a certain form of gram out of this, we can. And we can use NLTK to do that. So now we can see that there's different parts of speech in this sentence. Say we want a noun phrase from the text, and we want our noun phrase to be a determiner, optionally, followed by adjectives and or nouns. We can pass the grammar with our regex parser, so we've written some regex there to say our noun phrase should be a determiner, followed by adjectives and nouns, and we pass it using good old-fashioned regex, and get the output and then print it. We can see that our noun phrase is the starship. Starts with a determiner and it has a noun. Pretty straightforward, pretty useful stuff if you have lots of text you need to analyze. Next thing we're going to quickly look at in NLTK is lemmatization. Lemmatization tries to find the base stem of a word by finding its dictionary root word. There is a less accurate non-dictionary approach we can show you in a second, but first we'll just download the WordNet Lemmatizer. WordNet is a big database of words and their stems and so on and so on. You can just pull it from NLTK. WordNet is amazing. I've run the Lemmatizer. Let's look at the lemmatization of studies, dogs, and feet. So see the root word of studies is study, the root word of dogs is dog, and the root word of feet is foot. Stemming is a much simpler computational version of the same thing that will probably get things wrong but is quicker. Porter stemmer is just one of the many stemmers that NLTK has. There are others, you can look them up. Let's run stemming on plum, plumbing, plums, and plumbed. They'll all be plum. In this case it's correct, but it's not always correct because it's doing it computationally rather than using a dictionary. It does not know these words, it is just guessing. Finally with NLTK, let's make a word cloud. A word cloud is a great way to get a really quick visualization of some data so you can kind of understand what's going on in a visual way. It's a good way for a human to figure out the sort of questions you might want to ask computationally. Here we've generated a word cloud from our Pride and Prejudice text. You can see Bennett, Mr., want, truth, wife, universal are all very popular words in the Pride and Prejudice text. So that's our really quick intro to NLTK. We're going to do a little bit more of an advanced example next, but I strongly suggest you check out NLTK, it's really useful. It's at nltk.org, but I'll put the link up on Twitter at the end. Okay, so that was a simple activity. Let's have a look at a little bit more complex activity. In this activity, we're going to classify some text, again on Google Colab. We're going to use the wine reviews dataset, which is on Kaggle. I'll show you that when we do the demo though. Let's get started. So here we have our Colab notebook. I'll provide a link that you can play with this yourself later. We're going to step through this. We're going to step through this. So here is our wine review example. First, we're going to do some importing. And I'm going to use the bag of words approach that we talked about earlier, so you'll see how that works in actual practice. First, we need to import some stuff from the frameworks we're going to be using. And now we're going to use a variety of frameworks this time, a little bit more than you saw in the NLTK demo. And use Pandas to grab data frames. Pandas is a great Python tool for pulling in data and manipulating it. Matplotlib, Seaborn for visualization, and some stuff like that. Really useful, you'll see as we go. Our data is this wine review dataset, which I grabbed from Kaggle. While I download that, I'll just show you the wine review dataset. It's on Kaggle. There's 130,000 wine reviews. They're basically variety, location, winery price, description, reviewer. And it's wine snobs talking about wine. This is a fruity body with a good air and a good palate and a good so on. Once we've loaded that CSV file in, we'll just do a little head on it, which is give us the first 5 entries of the data table. You can see there's regions, there's ratings out of 100, which is the points column. There's the Twitter handle of the taster. You'll notice there's some garbage in there, like not a number, nan, and some empty fields. That might be a problem when we do data analysis on it. But basically, the column we're looking at there is the variety. There's Pinot Gris, there's Riesling, there's Portuguese Red. Basically, these wine reviewers have some text in the description field where they describe the wine, and there's also a variety which we know the wine is. So we're going to try and write a machine learning model that can take a description of wine and tell us what the variety is. And we'll use this to train it. Let's have a little quick look through our data to see what sorts of questions we might be able to answer using this data. Remembering that we want to look for the variety in a minute. Okay, so some questions we might want to answer today. Does a higher points rating from our wine snob equal a higher price of the wine? So does a more expensive wine actually get a better rating? That's the first thing we're going to have a look at here. And we can quickly see if that can be answered using our data by plotting it. So we'll plot it in a bar plot here and a box plot in a second. First, we'll run the bar plot. The bar plot's going to be run. Google Colab lets you run each cell individually, which is really useful. Here's our bar plot. So it does look like higher rated wines, which is the x-axis, do generally trend to be more expensive, yes. Just on the face of it. We would need to do some more exploration to answer that question properly. But yes, on the face of it, perhaps. Here's a box plot, and we can see, yes, the hypothesis is possibly correct in this case. Higher ratings lead to more expensive wines lead to higher ratings. Maybe. It's a good way just to explore this sort of data and see if our initial theories are correct. In this case, they probably are. Let's have a look at another question. Do some reviewers just rate wines higher than other critics, or do they all sort of scatter across the distribution? Here's a nice plot of that. We can see that actually most reviewers land all across the spectrum from 80 to 100 as far as their rating out of 100 goes. Some of them sort of live around 80 to 90, but no, for the most part, they're all pretty reasonably spread between 80 and 100. That's quite interesting. This is a great kind of plot for visualizing this kind of data, though. You can learn a lot about data just by visualizing it. Okay, so remembering our word cloud earlier, we can learn what words occur more in reviews. Now, this is a great way to become a wine snob instantly. If you need a cheat sheet to sound like a wine snob, just make a word cloud from all the wine reviews you can find and look at it. So I'm just going to plot a word cloud here. This word cloud is going to exclude stop words, which are like the ands, ors, ifs, because they're probably not relevant to being a wine snob. But once we've generated the word cloud, we'll know exactly what words wine snobs say more often, and we'll be able to use them and impress people. So we'll just wait for that to run, and then we'll have a look at our word cloud. So you can see wine snobs like to say wine a lot. That's probably reasonable. But they also like to say dried, expressive, acidity, flavors, pineapple, fruit, broom, crisp. All sorts of words you wouldn't necessarily expect a wine snob to say, but there they are. They say them a lot nonetheless. Melange. What a great word. Aromas, drinkable. You get the idea. Let's get the data ready to answer our problem of being able to figure out what wine it is based on a variety. Here's all the varieties in this data. There's a lot of them. You can see there's 1,362 Zinfandels in the review. There's 81 Zweigels. There's one Zilovka. Not sure what any of those things are, except for Zinfandel, but they're wine varieties nonetheless. And there's a lot in this database. There's a lot. So there's 590, which, means we can probably have a good range of things to predict on. So we'll create a bag of words. We're going to use scikit-learn, which is the machine learning framework I'm using here. You could use pretty much any machine learning framework and create a bag of words. Scikit-learn calls this a count vectorizer. That makes sense. It takes all our text, removes all the stop words, and then creates a vector of numbers that represents the description data. So it's counting things and putting them in a vector. This means our descriptions of wine will be represented as numbers that a computer can do maths on. So first we'll remove data that's null or not a number. Remember there are lots of empty columns there and lots of nan, not a numbers. We'll just remove that with this drop NA, which is part of pandas. Very useful. Then we'll say our descriptions are going to be the data frame descriptions column. So we're only working on that column of data that was wine descriptions. And we'll create a vectorizer. So you'll see that the vectorizer actually has a whole bunch of parameters there, like true, stop words English, n-gram range and stuff like that. True on lowercase means we would like it to lowercase everything, so we're not considering case as a thing here. Stop words, we want to use the English stop words, so we want to use the English words for and, of, the, and our n-gram range is 1 to 2. That means we're looking at individual words by themselves as well as pairs of words. We're also going to do 5,000 features max. We might want to do more to make it converge better, but 5,000 is probably enough for a quick demo. And we'll fit it into the vector that we need. So we're going to run that, which is going to create a bag of words. So this command here is actually just generating a big table of words and their frequencies from all those wine reviews. We'll print that out just to have a look. Yep, so these are all the settings of that vectorizer. So you can see there's stuff we didn't control or override, but we could if we wanted to. We could also lemmatize or stem things in here. So if we wanted it to treat fruity, fruits as the same word, we could ask it to do that here if we wanted to. That would probably increase accuracy, but we're not going to do that for time reasons today. Let's have a quick look at the features of our data. You can see there's a whole bunch of grams, n-grams where there's 2 words, or just grams where there's a single word, 14 Cabernet, 15 alcohol, 15 Merlot. These are all things that are present in the data as a pair of things together. There's a lot of them. There's way too many for us to individually read out here. There's years, which we could probably strip if we wanted to be more accurate. There's You know, lots of comments about acidity gives, acidity keeps, acidity light, acidity fresh, acidity tip, sip. These are things that are paired together. These are n-grams, or bigrams in this case. Let's print out our first description and our first vector just to see that we've got the data correctly. So this is the first bit mask for the first review. So you'll see there it's truncated because Google Colab, but you can see we have a review and we have a bit mask that represents which words appear in this review. So this is mapping directly to the example we looked at earlier in the slides. This is a very long bit mask, so it truncates in the middle because there's lots of words in the reviews. Let's have a quick look at the vocabulary. There's lots and lots of words. There's 3,632 mentions of regular, 708 mentions of bottling, and so on and so on. And because we asked for 5,000 features, we've limited ourselves to 5,000 words, or n-grams, bigrams. So now we're going to train. Again, similar parameters on our training vectorizer. We want 3,000 features this time though, otherwise training will take too long. And we want to run 2dents on this just to make sure it's all nicely normalized and compressed properly. We'll also set our label in a second to be variety because the thing we want to be able to predict is the variety. So in this case, we're training it to spit out a variety given a description. So we'll run that. Next, we'll split the data 80-20. It's convention with machine learning to split some of your data out to use for testing. In this case, we're going to take 80% for training, 20% for testing, and we'll commence training using a logistic regression algorithm. That's going to take a while, so we're going to speed it up. We picked a logistic regression algorithm because we want to predict values in a range. In this case, the values are how many of certain words appear in different things. We could pretty much use any algorithm in this case. It's a pretty simple problem. We've just sped up here on the training so we can see the training. You can see it's complaining about convergence not happening. It will eventually converge, but it'll take its time. So we've sped that up, and now our training is actually finished. That's great. The accuracy of this model is probably going to be pretty rubbish because we did it very quickly and we didn't really optimize it, because this is kind of the first pass of when you do maybe lots of passes to get something good. We'll check our accuracy. I reckon it's going to be around 60%. I'll settle for 60%. Accuracy is 59. Good enough. So with an accuracy of 59%, we should predict, 2/3 of the time, give or take, correctly. So let's do some tests. Here we have some strings of reviews that were not in the training or testing data. A review of a Pinot, a review of a Tasmanian Chardonnay, a review of a Californian Zinfandel. Let's run the Pinot. So we'll assign test to that, and we'll run it on test to see what our newly trained model thinks that is. It's a Pinot, amazing. Look at us go. Let's try the Tasmanian Chardonnay now. So this is test 2, a description of a Tasmanian Chardonnay from a winery I actually visited last week. Who knows? Let's see, does it think it's the right thing? It's a Chardonnay. It doesn't know it's Tasmanian because we didn't teach it the difference between Tasmanian Chardonnay and Chardonnay. And finally, a Californian Zinfandel. What do we think? Will our model get this right? It does. Amazing. And that's actually pretty useful. We can also look at the other things it thinks it might be. So in this case, it thinks it's more likely to be a Zinfandel, but maybe it has a very low chance of also being a Pinot or a Syrah, or some sort of Bordeaux or Cabernet Sauvignon, but it's pretty confident it's a Zinfandel in this case. Again, with some more work, we could make this model a lot better and a lot more accurate. This is actually pretty good accuracy for a first pass with minimal data cleaning though. And we could also stem the words, which would make it more accurate again, but take a lot more time to train. So that's pretty much everything we've got in this example. I hope that made sense. Again, I'll tweet out a link to this Colab notebook so you can play with it later. Let's see what we learned. It's all very easily, basically. NLP grew and improved slowly over many years. It started accelerating in the late 90s, and throughout the 2010s it improved almost month by month. Today's NLP is complicated and based on a conglomeration of approaches. There's no one single approach anymore. However, transformers are very popular. NLP is really easy to get started in because most of the de facto standards for machine learning like TensorFlow, Scikit, PyTorch, so on have really good NLP functionality built right in. Just like you saw, we didn't have to code anything complicated to make that work. There's a lot of challenges we still face though. The road ahead is increasingly statistical, using methods like those we looked at today. This has lots of advantages, mostly related to scaling. It scales really well. It's semi-autonomous. The computer does a lot of the work. And it requires a lot less engineering, a lot less programming. But like most deep learning methods, it's kind of hard to debug. It often lacks context, and it requires a lot of data to be sensible. Hardware for ML is really big right now, and a lot of it really helps NLP stuff. Because deep learning tasks like transformers for NLP are very parallelizable, the architecture of GPUs and TPUs particularly, that's hardware with hundreds or even thousands of quite simple, compared to CPUs, cores, that are good at floating point math, which makes NLP a lot easier. CPUs have fewer but more complex cores, so parallelizable tasks are not as straightforward on them. If you want to look at some next steps to learn this, I recommend you check out this book, Deep Learning for Natural Language Processing. I really like it. I didn't write it. Check it out. Google Colab is amazing for experimenting. It's a really good way to learn this without having to install all sorts of stuff on your own computer. I hope that you enjoyed this talk. Feel free to tweet at me. Thank you to John for being the AV technician and to my wife, Mars, for writing a lot of this talk with me. Here's some references. I recommend you read all 3 of these papers. They're actually quite approachable. Thank you very much.